Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a fascinating source text called When the Righteous Suffer. It basically tries to completely reframe how we understand our deepest pain by looking closely at three extraordinary historical lives. You know, if you've ever found yourself in the dark, just wondering why things are falling apart, well, this analysis really unpacks how ancient theology tackles those exact, highly modern questions. Okay, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with the problem of suffering itself. Then we'll look at three historical lives, Job, Joseph, and Paul, before zooming out to the ultimate lens of the cross, and finally figuring out how to ask better questions. So, let's jump right into section 1, the problem of suffering. When tragedy strikes, we usually see philosophies offering up one of four different explanations. Some will say suffering is just an illusion. Others say, no, it's totally meaningless, just random atoms crashing together. Then you have some religious thinkers who suggest it's a direct punishment for something you did wrong. And others, they just shrug and call it bad luck or fate. But the biblical text we're exploring today presents a very different view. It argues that history actually has deep, profound meaning. And that brings us to this really shocking paradox presented in the text. God's greatest servants often suffer the most. I know, it sounds completely counterintuitive, right? But the source argues that this suffering actually isn't about a lack of love. Instead, it claims it happens because these individuals are being entrusted with greater purposes. So keep that framework in the back of your mind as we look at our first historical life. Moving on to section 2, Job and the unanswered question. To really understand Job's story, we have to look at what the text calls the cosmic courtroom. Right at the opening of Job, we're introduced to this figure called Ha-Satan, which is Hebrew for the accuser or the adversary. And this accuser essentially argues that Job only loves God for his gifts. He's saying, hey, Job just loves the comfortable life, not the Creator. So in the narrative, it's actually God's worth being put on trial here, not Job's wealth. We as the reader get a front row seat to this heavenly courtroom, but Job, he's left entirely in the dark. The text uses Job's friends to perfectly illustrate the danger of shallow theology. You see, they operated on this incredibly simplistic premise. Good people prosper, bad people suffer. So therefore, Job must have done something terrible. They just assumed all suffering was a punishment. But the source argues that the cosmic reality is actually much more complex, that suffering can in fact be a profound test of pure devotion. So this source extracts three hidden lessons from Job's story. First off, suffering is often framed as part of something way bigger than the individual. Job literally had no idea his faithfulness would become one of history's greatest testimonies. Second, it tackles that awful ache of feeling abandoned, asserting that God's silence is not God's absence. And third, when God finally does speak, he gives a revelation of himself rather than an explanation. The takeaway here? Knowing God actually outweighs completely understanding your circumstances. All right, section 3, Joseph and preparation through pain. When we map out Joseph's journey, it reveals a core argument of the text. Every single injustice he faced was actually a crucial step in a divine training program. Think about it. His brothers betrayed him, which taught him to understand betrayal. He was falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, which uniquely prepared him to be a fair judge. He was thrown into prison, teaching him absolute patience. By the time he actually reached the highest levels of leadership in Egypt, the narrative emphasizes that absolutely nothing was wasted. There's a crucial point captured in this astonishing statement from Genesis 50:20. Joseph looks right at his brothers, the very guys who sold him into slavery, and says, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." The source makes a great point here. The Hebrew word for meant is actually about devising or weaving. It shows how the text views God actively weaving human freedom, even malicious human freedom, into a much broader ultimate plan. And that brings us to the third hidden lesson of this theology, the idea that God often accomplishes his greatest works through events he never morally approves of. The human intentions, the betrayal, the lies, the slavery, those were all sinful acts, for sure. But the divine intention running concurrently is presented as entirely good and redemptive. The narrative posits that God doesn't just passively react to evil. He actually incorporates those sinful acts into an ultimate redemption without ever becoming the author of that evil. Which leads us seamlessly to hidden lesson number 4. Joseph never became bitter. Why? Well, the text indicates he interpreted his history through providence, not people. By flat-out refusing to let the evil actions of his brothers become the defining interpretation of his life, Joseph was able to forgive. He recognized a massive truth within this framework. While people are entirely responsible for their actions, God ultimately remains sovereign over the outcome. Let's move to section 4, pain
and suffering as strategy.
Now, this presents a paradox that completely redefines success, according to the source material. The world's definition of success, comfort equals blessing, which, let's be honest, is highly circumstantial. But Paul's definition of success is that faithfulness equals blessing, framing it as something eternal. Where the world desperately seeks to remove pain, Paul looked at his chains and his prison time as a deliberate strategy. Because he was in chains, the royal guards literally had to hear his message. The text highlights how he saw his suffering as a powerful vehicle to advance his cause.
Paul famously wrote about having a thorn in the flesh that he begged God to remove 3 times, but the answer was no. Speaking to that universal thorn, that deep pain God refuses to remove, the text draws out hidden lesson 5. Sometimes God heals, and sometimes God sustains. While our modern culture absolutely loves a miraculous healing, the text emphasizes that God's sustaining grace in our utter weakness is presented as being just as miraculous as a physical healing.
Section 5. The ultimate lens. The cross. Before looking at that ultimate lens, the source text gives us 6 rapid-fire lessons that show the hidden gems of suffering. It argues that suffering reveals the idols that prosperity conceals. It strips away false identities tied to wealth or status. It massively enlarges our compassion for others. It kills self-sufficiency, teaching us dependence. It loosens our grip on temporary earthly things. And most profoundly, it identifies believers with their ultimate example. Job, Joseph, and Paul didn't redefine God based on their suffering. The text asserts they interpreted their suffering through God's proven, steadfast character.
Ultimately, the source points these 3 pillars directly to Jesus and the cross. Arguing that God does not remain distant from human pain, he enters directly into it. According to this theology, he bears the injustice, the betrayal, and the abandonment, and then transforms the greatest apparent defeat into history's absolute greatest victory. It tells the sufferer that, at the end of the day, they are never truly alone in their pain.
And finally, Section 6. Asking better questions. When the bottom drops out of your life, the most natural human reaction is to ask, why is this happening to me? But instead of demanding explanations that may honestly never come, just like we saw in Job's story, the text gently redirects our focus toward entirely different questions, starting with, how can I remain faithful here?
The theology insists that suffering is never wasted, so it shifts the mindset to questions like, how might this exact pain equip someone to serve another person who's hurting? How can this loss actually deepen an understanding of faith? What bizarre, totally unexpected opportunities for witness has this trial created? Through this specific lens, the text shows how trials are actively woven into a redemptive purpose.
I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought from the source. It's a question to carry with you today, tomorrow, and into literally whatever hardship you might face. In the very midst of a current trial, when you absolutely can't see the way out, ask yourself, what beautiful thing is God forming in you? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep asking the right questions, and I'll see you next time.